Welcome to Pelenaros Taylor Unplugged on Sunday, the 29th of September 2024. Well, today it's a weekend, and I think we're about 40 days to go before the American election. It's advancing at rapid clip. Trump met Zelensky, whose fate he has in hands if he wins, and it was by all accounts, cool meeting. Zelensky has been targeted by Trump in his campaign speeches for being the world's best salesman. Every time he comes to America, he walks off with $61 billion. And there's a bit of a spat where a bad blood between the two. And anyone who could see when they two emerged after the meeting on Friday at, I think it was the Trump Tower, and Zelensky looking uncharacteristically down. I haven't seen him so down since he was nixed NATO membership at the Vilnius summit, I think it was last year. And Trump said what practically no one has ever said in Zelensky's presence for the last couple of years, and all this soft soaping and traveling around and Mother Teresa treatment. Putin and I get on well, sort of thing. And then when Zelensky was kind of sucking up to him, Trump put him down with the words, "It takes two to tango." And of course, Trump is very well aware that there have been 2 assassination attempts against him, and exactly which components of the deep state, if it was the deep state, I don't think it was lone killers in either case, which components, if there was no Ukrainian input or not, direct or indirect, certainly Ruth II, would-be assassin, had connections to Ukraine. He'd been around the place there, a bit like an earlier generation of activists sought Cuba and believed in the killing Castro, and anyone who got close to Castro, like the Kennedy brothers, was in trouble in America. Well, ditto. Trump is a kind of enemy of the people who want a successful Cuban revolution, if you like, in modern terms of the Ukrainian war against Russia. It's the sort of the right-wing cause, or the militarists' cause du jour. Anyway, Trump has made it clear that he won't be swayed from his peace proposal, meaning that he'll try and bring peace to that unfortunate part of the world as soon as he's elected on the 5th of November. The polls favour him, so he's very well aware that there are lots of people who are out to target him, and the Ukrainians certainly have a motive to take him out, hence the cool demeanour. Well, that's that. It seems, I was just reading an article by Mark Urban in the Sunday Times this morning. Sunday Times is a sort of place where you place intelligence articles. The MI6 brief their contacts in the Fleet Street, and they say what's going on. Mark Urban is a well-respected BBC Telegraph, I think, journalist, a former officer in the Royal Tank Regiment. And some people have mentioned him in connection with the Skripals who disappeared 6 years ago after alleged poisoning by Russian spies in Salisbury. What few people mentioned was that Urban was around then and interviewing the Skripals, and he also knew Pablo Miller, who I think was the brothers, the Skripals' handler back in the days when he was still in Russia. And Pablo Miller is a deeply anti-Russian activist, knows Mark Urban well and briefs Mark Urban. We'll come to that more in a moment. Anyway, we still don't know. I mean, Mark Urban, as far as I can tell, hasn't told, I think, everything that he knows about the Skripals. I think he's kind of semi-complicit in that psyops, if you like, against, meant to bring down the Russians' reputation, to which it largely succeeded in doing. Well, Mark Urban was kind of writing, he was rather pessimistic. He compared two conflicts: the Israeli conflict, when Netanyahu ignored Biden's advice to calm down and just went his own way, and then Zelensky's failure to prevail upon the Americans to help him, and with British putting considerable pressure on the Americans. So here is the Israelis repainting the Middle East with their strikes on that killed the head of Hezbollah, and bombing and doing things with impunity, and Iran forever shaking its fist but never doing anything. And Zelensky's failure to get the Americans to okay the missiles that could get them to do the same thing, and against the Russians, with the Russians playing presumably in Urban's scenario, head fist clenching hopelessness that the Iranians are currently displaying, and that Ukraine needed that to get to victory. And he blamed, Urban did, citing two articles, one in the Wall Street Journal and one in the New York Times, making it very clear that the American intelligence community in the Pentagon did not think it was a good idea to fire off these storm shadows and maybe even American ATACMS. They're not enough to make a difference. Basically, the West has wound down its stocks of practically everything. Very few British journalists mentioned that. And that even if it made a difference, there were not enough other measures that could be brought in to make a difference in the conflict as a whole. And anyway, the Russians had moved some of their bases beyond strike range of those missiles. And of course, the Russians have said that they'll go to war, something that Urban kind of didn't point out, It's just they use words like saber rattling or Russian threats. But the point is they've said it'll be war. Don't F around and find out, British journalists. You're sitting there in your hormonally enlarged newsrooms where everyone is just gagging to have a fighting keyboardists. But of course, none of those have ever seen a real war. And war sells newspapers. If you only could wish I could send these guys to the front. They don't know what they're talking about. I think it should be criminal offence to advocate for war. If you're advocating for less immigration is practically a criminal offence, why not make calling for war? And you'd lock up most of the columnists, the Daily Telegraph, the Times, and the Observer. And anyway, so Mark Urban's saying this. He's kind of saying, well, it's not going to happen. The British strikes are not going to happen. And significantly, what one new thing he brought to the table through his contacts in the Foreign Office is the Foreign Office said, well, he couched it in the kind of gung-ho language. The British, of course, are still firm behind Ukraine, but the Foreign Office is deeply disappointed by the failure to step up to the plate of the French and the Germans, above others. Well, the French, I thought actually in other articles, it's in the British journalist interest to say that everyone's on board with this, and they'll pick quotes from unnamed diplomats and dot it around their article to give this impression of popular widespread support, But, it could be the same Baltic dwarfs being quoted each time, But the point is the major countries are obviously clearly against it. I thought Macron might be in favour of allowing the scalps, which is the French equivalent to the storm shadows. But according to the Mark Urban article, the French and the Germans are equally against. We know from other coverage that Italians are against. I know that the Mediterranean countries are generally against escalation. We know that the Scandinavians are generally in favour, and the Balts. But the French and the big European countries far outweigh them in importance. And of course, we've got the behemoth and mammoth, the huge country that doesn't want to involve in a war, America, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, too powerful a bloc to be ignored by the warhawk NATO nations, which is basically more or less the same nations that we had back in 2021, the Scandinavians, the Balts, the Brits, possibly the Romanians. It looks, by the way, that Mark Urban phrases the article, that it's, the Foreign Office, the Brits are not going to go ahead with missile strikes on their own. He said, well, I guess this leaves the open possibility that the Brits might be able to drop a storm shadow on Russia. But the phrasing in the two most important articles in the American press, Wall Street Journal and New York Times, suggests that that's not even that's going to happen. It creates a climate that's negative to that. In other words, what he's saying is that the British will be totally isolated on that. The American intel community won't allow it, and Britain will find itself alone. So I don't think the Brits are going to go and do that. Although you could also see the article as, there will be some people in the British intel and military community will be totally emboldened by what Netanyahu's doing with apparent impunity, and say, well, the Israelis can do their Churchill thing and strike out enemies and militarily escalate, which is what what Urban says you've got to do sometimes, Yeah, except not against a nuclear power with 6,000 missiles aimed at the West, any one of which could have wiped out London. But anyway, that's Urban. And the reason why I was going to connect it to Pablo Miller was a young intelligence officer in Estonia in the 1990s. And I don't know how relevant that is to what happens in the Estonia ferry scenario, which I sketched. Was he part of it? Was he one of the chief smugglers of weapons, which may have occasioned the Russian strike on the Estonia ferry? I was in Estonia in the early 1990s. I remember that period well. It was a period where, my translator found a human leg in her dustbin, a figure of where there were hundreds of murders in tiny Tallinn. And I was declared persona non grata for publicizing this rather than writing about the stories of jolly investment opportunities that the newly independent country offered. And I remember, there was almost nothing to eat, nothing to buy in the supermarkets. There were just empty shelves everywhere, and you had hyperinflation for a while, like Germany year zero in 1945. Of course, the Russian Empire just imploded, and the trade links between all the former Soviet republics had all severed. So, if you had all the washing machine factories in Latvia, they needed to source spare parts from Kazakhstan, but Kazakhstan and Latvia didn't share a common currency anymore, and all the transport networks had broken down. So everything was in chaos. And it was a fantastic time, I have to say, exciting time for cheap vodka and cheap girls if you were a young journalist, and lots of stories. And I remember going down to the ferry terminal in Tallinn, where there was a nightly ferry to Stockholm. And, these women, these ladies in their 40s or 50s coming off, women working in office jobs in Stockholm and coming and clinking their duty frees and then getting back on again. And I thought, this is a world apart. These people live in a safe Sweden, and here is bad, impoverished Estonia. They don't know. On the surface, it looks like a medieval city, Tallinn, with a tourist paradise, but they really don't know. And I thought, something's going to happen. When you leave a fight and you think something's going to blow up. I had that distinct feeling when I saw that. And the ferry that was transporting people back and forth on a nightly cruise, it's a tradition also to do it to Finland. You have a beautiful smorgasbord, totally unlike anything you can buy in Tallinn's shops, for all the people drinking and flirting and listening to Swedish pop on the bands, the dance bands that turned up on the floor. Anyway, that ferry was called the Estonia, and the Estonia ferry sank shortly after I left the country. And I always wondered who'd done it, because at the same time I was writing a lot of stories about smuggling of Western equipment to the Russian Soviet equipment from there to the West. And I didn't go into details about how it had happened, but I do remember, I have to dig out my old cuttings. There was something called the Estonian Shipping Company, ESCO, and I remember doing a story on that because they were shipping some armored cars, I think, from the Soviet stocks in Estonia. The Russians had pulled out, the Russian troops had been pulled out, but their equipment was for sale. They were earning $1 a month or something. So if you just sold a radar system or a tank or a couple of machine guns, you could make a year's salary if you were an impoverished Russian soldier. So there was a lot of that going on. MI6 and Swedish intelligence were stealing stuff and taking things, and Pablo Miller, I guess, was at the center of it. That's my guess. Anyway, on the 28th of September 1994, that is exactly 1 year ago today or yesterday, the MS Estonia sank en route from Tallinn to Stockholm, Sweden. It was carrying 989 passengers and crew, of whom 852 lives. It's the most worst maritime incident in peacetime history, apart from the Titanic, but it's far less well known. Again, because I think the Titanic's British, and the British media world, the Anglosphere, focuses on what's going on in their part of the world, whereas the Estonia ferry sinking was a Scandinavian, Germanic thing, and that has far less traction in the global media, but it's much more recent. But there you go. It's still a stark memory in my mind, and most Swedes will have watched endless documentaries and read books about it. I remember one about a couple, a girl was 20, very pretty, and a Swedish guy was 30, and they ended up spending the night in the raft together and keeping each other warm and hugging each other, and they were kind of helping each other along, and they pulled each other out of the water and things like that. And everybody was hoping for kind of Titanic scenario or something, that they would end up happily ever after. And I remember a big newspaper paying for their story and then allowing them to get out to a very expensive dinner and then photographing them having their dinner. And was the chemistry there a year later? Sadly not. They found different people, and a lot of people are sad about that. But his name is Kent Halstead. He wrote a cracking good memoir of that night. Anyway, so the Estonia, 852 people died. It was stormy seas, but not that stormy. I'll just give a timeline. The first sign of trouble was a strange sound of metal against metal heard around 1 o'clock in the morning when the ship was on the outskirts of the Turku archipelago, but an inspection of the bow visor showed no obvious damage. Then, according to the official story, the visor separated and the ship took on a heavy starboard list. That separation came as a result of the ship going into the rough seas and the bow visor smacking into the waves. The bow visor is the thing that goes up and lets the cars in, because it was a car cruise ship. Just a moment later, the ship took a heavy starboard list at 1:15. At 1:20, a heavy, weak female voice called "Here, here, lavalan here." The Estonian words for alarm, alarm. There's alarm on the ship. Just a moment later, an internal alarm for the crew was transmitted over the public address system. Soon after, the general lifeboat alarm was given. Soon the vessel lurched some 30 to 40 degrees to starboard, making it practically impossible to move safely inside the ship. Doors and hallways became deadly pits, of course. So if the hallway is like that vertically from the rest of the, you have to kind of jump, and the hallway no longer becomes a hallway, but basically a death trap, because once you fall down there, you can't get up and then move up to the stairs, to the decks, and onto the lifeboats. The MS Estonia directed a call to MS Silja Europa, and only after making contact with her did the radio operator utter the word Mayday in English. Estonia, are you calling Mayday? And after that, another voice took over on the Estonian. The conversation shifted to Finnish. A lot of the crew members were Finnish. The ships, these were neighbouring cruise ships going from Helsinki and Turku to Stockholm. I mean, these things are an institution. They go every night. They're big, expensive places with beautiful buffets and restaurants and dancing and Swedes. Stockholm is going on all these cruises all the time. Anyway, so there's the Mariella and the Celia were both cruise ships of this kind. They kind of closed in on the Estonia site. The radar screens of the radar signal of the Estonia disappeared at 1:50. The Mariella, one of those other cruise ships, arrived on the scene of the accident at 02:12, and the first rescue helicopter from Sweden arrived at 3:05 in the morning. The survivors were bobbing around in little life rafts around the sunken ship. Well, the ship went down just like that. One of the faster sinkings in history. Well, why did the ship sink so quickly? I mean, there's been a lot of speculation about that. And there's also a speculation with the survivors. First reports said that the second captain, Estonian Aavo Piet, had been rescued and was treated in Turku hospital, but afterwards he was declared missing and dead, as were two Estonian twin sisters who were dancers on the list. One nurse from Turku hospital had personally known Captain Piet and saw him there, but later took her back her saying and stated very strongly that she didn't want to discuss the murder anymore. So had he survived or not, where did he go if he'd been rescued? Why was he, and he was in hospital, why was he now missing? Anyway, when the investigation of the shipwreck started in the Swedes authorities, although it was in international waters, the Swedes kind of took control as the largest nation. Estonia was just a small country and deferred to the Swedes, and the Finns were not really part of it because not many passengers were from Sweden, although geographically the incident happened closely to the Finnish borders. But the Swedish government, after first promising to lift it, to elevate the ship, which sank, I think, 800 meters of water, you could have done it. They said, well, no, we're going to leave it down there. We're going to, as a memorial, as a kind of a wet grave, as it were. And then they started to fill the area of the wreck with concrete, which was stopped after a while. But, it made you ask why they had to do that. Did they have something to hide? In the early documentaries, 10 divers saw many human remains floating around the wreck or lying on the floor, and they could easily have been rescued and brought some peace to the families of the dead people. But nothing happened. Instead, the Swedes made a crime to dive around the wreck, and that's even though they had no authority to do so, since it was outside Swedish territorial waters. In 1999, the Joint Accident Investigation Commission responded to rumors in the media of bombs having caused the accident, but they ruled out traces of explosion in the bow visor after and completely closed out any possibility. They said it was the bad weather. Well, was it really? Well, there's a British journalist, a Kiwi journalist called Davis, who wrote an article in 2005 for the New Statesman, which I think is probably the best English language summary of it. And you just type in Steve Davis, New York, New Statesman, and you'll find that story. And we'll talk about it after a very quick. Welcome back to the Pelle and Roth Taylor Show, Unplugged. Well, we just talked about the Estonia ferry, and what happened was that the official inquiry said that it was the bow door visor smacking against the waves, and that fell off. But the 15-ton bow door, battered by high seas, has been ripped off as the locks gave way, letting water flood into the car deck, and the ferry become unstable and overturned. Moreover, the Swedish government went on to hire some divers from Rockwater, British-based division of the American Halliburton Group, run between 1995 and 2000 by Dick Cheney, who produced 13 videotapes showing the wreck from every angle but one. Those are critics of that showed that some angle was missing, a crucial angle, and some politicians argued that the videos had been edited. Leonard Berglund, chairman of the Foundation of Estonia Victims, said that there's still a lot of evidence out there. The major argument was that there's nothing new. But what happened? Enter an entrepreneur and a buccaneer called Greg Bemis, a native of Santa Fe in Mexico, is an entrepreneur and venture capitalist and former Republican Party politician. He's also a diving and salvage expert and owned the still submerged wreck of the British liner Lusitania, which sunk off the Irish coast in May 1915, and which the British tried to use to get the Americans into World War I. And the rumours are that Churchill deliberately, who's a Navy minister, deliberately withheld naval protection, which given to other ships coming down into the Irish Sea, the area south of the Irish Sea, where there was known to be German U-boats, in order to get the Lusitania sunk, and with lots of American posh passengers on board, that would bring the Americans into World War I. It didn't quite do so, but it did affect American opinion very negatively towards the Germans. So the Lusitania was a very famous sinking of a passenger ship in 1915, and Bemis owned it, and he dived around there. And he's interested in Estonia. He started diving around after being asked by relatives of the victims to investigate. He had to sail from neutral Germany rather than Sweden or Finland, because the Swedes, of course, had banned and made it illegal to do precisely what Bemis was doing. The Swedes dispatched military speedboats to circle his ships, while Coast Guard officers boarded and demanded a crew list, general harassment. Warrants for the arrest of Bemis were made by the Swedish prosecutor, and the offence carried a maximum penalty of 2 years in prison. But Bemis's divers, and from their base in Germany, went ahead and found a hole near the bow. They filmed the wreck and brought up pieces of metal cut from near the bow door. Tests at laboratories in the US and Germany showed signs of explosion on the ferry's hull. So maybe there were two explosions, one that blew off the bow doors and one elsewhere in the hull, that could account for the fact that some people on the lower decks reported water coming through very quickly, and a hole in the lower hull below the water line originally would allow that very rapid sinking to take place. Because if if water only came through the car decks, ultimately the ship would flip on its keel, as it were, and because there'd be air pockets in the area below the water line, which prevented the whole thing from sinking. That didn't happen. It sank right through, just like the Titanic did. So that's the explanation. There had to be maybe a second explanation. Anyway, the results show changes to the metal similar to those seen by high detonation velocity, one report concluded. However, the Baltic nations, including Sweden, denied everything and said that the main original conclusion stood. Well, we had a couple of years later, the Lennart Henriksson, the former head of customs of Stockholm, confirmed to Swedish television that MI6 and the shipments have been let through on orders from the highest authorities. That is, shipments containing electronic and military equipment on lorries or estate vehicles carried through there, which were not allowed to be stopped by Swedish customs. Now, what did they contain? Well, did they contain the kind of stuff that Davis's MI6 contact, which he talks about in this New Statesman article, who briefed him, saying, if you want to look into this, it's a British, Swedish, and Russian responsibility, or their roots of this. So what had happened is that, this story came out on Swedish television, and it was the story about the smuggling, and it was my friend Los Boines, who's Sweden's top investigative journalist, who talked about this. He's also done a lot of good work on the Palmer murder. He was told about that, and that because it was on Swedish state television, it created a stink. And the Swedes appointed an inquiry and said, there's nothing to see here. Hirschfeldt, who's the judge that concluded the inquiry, a cover-up man par excellence, said there's no basis for me to assume that the defence authority or the defence procurement officer was trying to transport defence materiel on board Sweden when the ship sank. Well, okay. It's interesting that Meyer Werft, the German shipyard that built the Estonia, that wanted to sort of distance itself from claims that their construction had been ultimately responsible. They also found traces of an explosion in the lab parts, in the ship parts brought to the surface by the American Bemis and his divers. What was the result? Well, Daves concludes, and there's been a lot of speculation online. Daves had contacts with Russian journalists, and they'd worked hard on the story for a couple of years. One television report in their media claimed that the Russian-Estonian mafia had placed a limpet mine on the hull using a miniature submarine to warn the shipping company to pay protection money. Either that, or it was perhaps a faction of the Russian intelligence or the GRU or something who was sabotaging it to send a shot across the bows of MI6 to stop using civilian ships to transport stolen top secret Russian military secrets from their air bases in Estonia. And that means that the guilt is sort of on two sides. The Russians for doing it, and perhaps they were only intended to send a warning. And then the Brits and the Swedes, of course, Swedish intelligence, for stealing these goods and then using civilian ships to transport it across to Sweden. And in effect, using, those ladies who lunch these unwitting cruise tourists with their duty-free drinks and their big appetites for the onboard lovely ship's buffet, blissfully unaware of what's going on in the geopolitics, using them as human shields and basically daring the Russians to do something because it was a civilian ship. So a lot of guilt all around there. And of course, with the Nord Stream explosion still in the news, the conflict between Britain, Sweden and Russia at fever pitch. It's very, very timely to talk about this. And the Estonia ferry, I grieve for it. One of my best friends' sisters died on it. And I sometimes think, when I go on night ferries, as I sometimes do, traveling around Europe, what it's like lying there in a cabin, and suddenly the whole thing turns upside down and you're struggling to get out of the door, and suddenly the corridor is vertical rather than horizontal, and you know that you're doomed in a couple of minutes. So I sometimes think about those things. So that is that. It was 30 years ago yesterday, the Estonia ferry disaster, and I guess perhaps we'll never know the entire truth, but the truth is not what you've been told in the mainstream media. That's for sure.